wasn't stolen from him. It wasn't ripped away in battle or usurped by some power-hungry cousin. No, Wenceslaus IV wore his crown until the end, but it rotted on his head. And by the time it was done with him, there was nothing left beneath it but the hollow wreckage of a king who'd forgotten who he was. He was born the son of Charles IV, the greatest emperor the Holy Roman Empire had seen in centuries. A man who carved power into stone, wrote laws into legend, and built Prague into the jewel of the empire. His son was meant to carry it all: the legacy, the weight, the armor, the glory. But Wenceslaus was not a warrior nor a lawgiver. He was a storm in a crown, and what began as a slow drift from responsibility soon collapsed into violent, trembling madness. At first, they said he was strange, withdrawn, prone to outbursts, to locking himself away with wine and shadows. But whispers grew. The servants stopped looking him in the eye, courtiers stopped turning their backs, and the bloodstains on the palace floors were no longer from war. They were from inside the throne room. Wenceslaus ruled technically, but power slipped through his fingers faster than wine spilled from his goblet. He struck terror into his own court and disgust into his own nobles. Until one day, even they decided this king no longer ruled anything, not even himself. But the story doesn't end with a sword or a noose. It ends in silence, in a forest, in a locked hunting lodge where no guards were stationed and no physicians called. Just a dead king, curled up like a child, eyes wide, mouth open, cold. This is not the tale of a fall from power. This is the story of a man who was never meant to wear the crown, but was forced to anyway. And as we begin, we must look not at how he died, but how he was made. He was never built to carry a legacy, only to be crushed beneath one. Wenceslaus was born in 1361 as the first son of Charles IV, the towering colossus of the Holy Roman Empire. His birth was not a celebration of life, but the sealing of expectation. From the moment he opened his eyes, they were already looking to his future, a future not written in hope, but obligation. The crown wasn't waiting for him, it was already circling above like a blade. He was crowned King of Bohemia at just 2 years old. At 11, he was declared King of the Romans. No childhood, no pause. Just pageantry, doctrine, and a nation staring through his skull, waiting for his father's strength to somehow sprout inside this fragile, silent boy. But Wenceslaus did not grow into greatness. He grew into fear, fear of failure, fear of never measuring up, fear of the throne his father built brick by brick, law by law, and as he matured, he did not harden, he fractured. His tutors spoke of intelligence, yes, but it was scattered, volatile. Like a glass crown held over fire, elegant, but already beginning to crack. The court spoke in whispers. He doesn't like light. He avoids the priests. He doesn't trust mirrors. He flinched at loud voices and stared too long into empty spaces. A servant once found him sitting in full coronation regalia at midnight, alone, speaking to the wall as if awaiting judgment. But no one intervened. Because when you are heir to an empire, your madness becomes a form of etiquette. It is tolerated until it starts to bleed, and that time was coming. The boy they dressed in velvet and gold was beginning to twitch beneath it. The crown was fitting looser now, not because his head had shrunk, but because his mind was slipping through it. The empire had given him titles. but it never gave him peace, and that's when the shadows began to stir. The making of a mad king wasn't an explosion, it was a quiet, growing sickness, and soon it would start to scream. The whispers didn't stop him, they fed him. Wenceslaus began to drown in his own court, not in blood, yet, but in a strange, bubbling murk of isolation and contempt. He withdrew from council, refused to speak to bishops, and started to trust only those who whispered sweet nothings into his spiraling thoughts. His days slipped into nights with no distinction. Wine replaced water. Superstition replaced law. The boy who once stared silently into the void was now laughing at it, arguing with it. He began roaming the palace at night, barefoot, muttering prayers in broken Latin, dragging his fingers along the stone walls like a blind man searching for a door that didn't exist. He raved about betrayal, about ghosts in the banners, about voices in the chandeliers, and he raved to no one, because by now no one came near unless summoned, and being summoned was dangerous. His mind became a locked corridor where reason had suffocated. He was reported to fall into fits, screaming, tearing at his clothes, striking himself. One chamberlain wrote that he found Wenceslaus alone in the library, surrounded by torn pages, babbling about how ink was poison and the words had teeth. The crown, he said, was eating his thoughts, and the saints were laughing at him. And still, none dared speak aloud what everyone saw. Their king had gone mad, but even in madness, he was still their ruler. His seal still burned on decrees. His hand still signed names. His voice still condemned. That was the true horror, not that he was lost, but that he was still in charge. One day, a servant spilled wine at dinner. Wenceslaus said nothing, not at first. But hours later, the man was dragged into the throne room and forced to drink from the flagon until he passed out. He never woke up. The cause of death, royal displeasure. There was no war, no revolution, no chaos in the streets. Just quiet dread spreading through the walls of power like rot in old stone. Something was unraveling. The king was not just unstable, he was unpredictable, unreachable, and soon he would become something worse than mad. He would become violent. The crown no longer trembled on his head, it lashed out. By the turn of the 1390s, Wenceslaus was no longer just broken, he was dangerous. The line between madness and malice had disintegrated, and in its place stood a sovereign who killed not out of necessity, but mood. Court records became riddled with disappearances. Servants, scribes, and advisors who spoke too directly, walked too loudly, or simply breathed the wrong way vanished. The palace was quiet, not because of peace, but because fear had hollowed every hallway. One scribe dared to correct a royal document, just a phrase, just a word. Wenceslaus dragged him into the throne room and, in full regalia, demanded that his skin be flayed in front of the court. And it was. His blood soaked into the flagstones beneath the throne, and no one moved, not even the queen. Because by then they all understood. The king's wrath was law, and the law was insane. He ordered executions by whim, without trial or record. One knight was boiled alive in oil for misplacing a royal ring. Another was buried alive for dreaming treason. The absurdity wasn't just the violence, it was the precision. Wenceslaus didn't explode, he curated cruelty. With calm, deliberate focus, as if killing made him feel real. As if the only time he felt like a king was when someone else was dying. But his worst killings were the ones no one spoke of, those that happened in silence. Guards found attendants locked in cellars, beaten until they couldn't speak. Others were chained to pillars in underground chambers with no light, no water. One was sewn into a bare carcass and left to rot. The record didn't explain why. It didn't need to. And all the while, Wenceslaus slept soundly above them, dreaming of betrayal, dreaming of thrones made of teeth. He said the nobles were watching him through the walls, that even the angels had turned away. It was no longer a question of if something would snap. It had. The only question was whether the kingdom would survive its king, or if it would do the unthinkable, put him in a cage. They didn't depose him, they locked him away like an animal. In the summer of 1394, after years of silence, the nobility of Bohemia finally moved. They didn't raise armies, they didn't issue manifestos. They simply came quietly, deliberately, and seized their king. No resistance, no bloodshed, because by then, even the guards had stopped believing in the man they were paid to protect. Wenceslaus was taken from his chambers and dragged into captivity, not by foreign enemies or rival monarchs, but by the very lords who once bowed at his feet. They imprisoned him in the castle of Wildburg, a high stone keep with cold walls and no witnesses. What happened inside is only known through fragments, but what survives is disturbing. He screamed through the nights, clawed at the doors, bit his own hands until they bled. He was kept under constant watch, not for fear of escape, but fear of what he might do to himself, or what he might summon. One jailer later wrote that Wenceslaus refused to eat for days unless the food was tasted by a priest. He claimed the bread whispered to him, that the wine was filled with the memories of the dead. He would speak to cracks in the stone, whisper prayers to God, then immediately curse him in the same breath. He said the devil was under the floor. He begged for absolution and then promised vengeance, but no letter of abdication came. No formal deposition. The nobles didn't want a new king, they just wanted the mad one to be still. So they left him in that cell, crowned but powerless, sealed like a secret too shameful to speak aloud. He spent months there, some say a year, and when he emerged, his beard tangled, his eyes sunken, he didn't ask for his throne, he didn't speak of justice. He just asked to go home, as if he had never been king at all. The madness hadn't left him. It had matured, settled deeper, quieter. And in that silence, a new horror took shape. A monarch returned, not restored, and a court that had no idea what he might become next. Because though he had lost everything, he still wore the crown. He returned to the throne, but it no longer answered to him. After his release, Wenceslaus drifted back into Prague like a ghost wearing a crown. The streets did not cheer, the court did not kneel. There were no declarations of triumph, no songs of restoration. Just silence and the uneasy creak of power resuming its old posture, bent, not broken, but deeply, irrevocably stained. Though still King of Bohemia in name, his authority had become a brittle fiction. And worse, his title as King of the Romans, the sacred stepping stone to emperorship, was slipping. In 1400, the prince-electors convened without him. No summons, no explanation, and in a single brutal vote, They declared Wenceslaus unfit to reign over the empire. He was deposed without even being present to defend himself. In his place, they crowned Rupert of the Palatinate. Wenceslaus didn't fight it. He barely acknowledged it. He spent his days surrounded by animals, lions, monkeys, birds, creatures who, he said, were more honest than men. He refused counsel, turned away emissaries, and held audiences in his private menagerie. At night, he walked alone along the castle walls, muttering to the sky. One witness claimed the king spoke to the stars, calling them by name, arguing with them like old enemies. His courtiers dared not speak of the deposition. To do so was to invite his fury, or worse, his attention. For though he had lost his empire, Wenceslaus still held the full weight of Bohemia's law. And he wielded it like a blade dulled by madness, swinging it without rhythm, without mercy. Loyal servants were imprisoned without charge. Entire towns were stripped of rights on a whim. And when a papal envoy demanded explanation for a broken treaty, Wenceslaus reportedly threw a goblet at his head and told him, "The devil writes my diplomacy now." He had become what the crown always feared, a ruler who knew he had no future and therefore no restraint. But in his paranoia, Wenceslaus found something unexpected, not salvation, not redemption, but a name spoken by scholars and students, whispered in sermons and shouted in streets. A preacher, a heretic, a spark, and the king would lean toward that spark, not realizing it would set all Bohemia on fire. He couldn't rule his own court, so he turned to rule the flames. In the early 15th century, as Wenceslaus drifted deeper into paranoia and silence, a new voice began to echo through Prague. Jan Hus, scholar, reformer, preacher, was no soldier, no nobleman, and certainly no king. But he spoke with something Wenceslaus hadn't possessed in years: clarity. His sermons condemned the church's corruption, mocked papal indulgences, and demanded a return to moral truth. In a city choking on political decay and royal apathy, his words struck like thunder. And Wenceslaus, in his fractured wisdom, allowed it. Some say he supported Hus out of genuine conviction. Others whisper it was simply to spite the Pope. Yet another authority he could not control and would not obey. But whatever his reasons, Wenceslaus protected the preacher. He let the fire burn. He let the crowds grow. He let the fury rise. And when Rome roared back with threats of excommunication and interdict, Wenceslaus did not flinch. He didn't silence Hus. He didn't ban the sermons. Instead, he watched, detached and grim, as his kingdom fractured beneath him, not from foreign war or noble revolt, but from a priest's voice cutting through the rot. Churches closed. Processions halted. Entire districts fell into theological chaos. Bohemia was no longer a realm, it was a battlefield of faith. Nobles chose sides. Cities built walls within walls. And through it all, Wenceslaus remained distant. He refused to intervene, refused to crush the movement, refused even to speak Hus's name in council. He sat in his palace, surrounded by beasts, reading broken letters from Rome and laughing. When asked for a response, he reportedly said, "Let God and the devil settle it. I've done enough for both." He hadn't ignited the fire, but he'd let it consume the floorboards. And as Jan Hus grew louder and the papacy more furious, the flames reached the base of the throne itself. Soon, one man would burn, and another would vanish into the forest. The fire took Hughes, but the silence swallowed Wenceslaus. In 1415, Jan Hughes was condemned by the Council of Constance and burned alive for heresy. His death sent shockwaves through Bohemia, but Wenceslaus said nothing. No protest, no vengeance, no final gesture of defiance. He simply withdrew. As his kingdom wept and seethed, he retreated into his private hunting lodge, far from the city, far from the altar, far from the ashes of the man he once shielded. The king who had allowed a heretic to rise now refused to reckon with the consequences. He did not call for calm. He did not prepare for war. He wandered the woods with his hunting dogs, spoke only in fragments, and often refused to wear his crown. His servants noted he would sit for hours in the same chair, staring into the forest as if waiting for something to emerge. When one asked if he planned to return to Prague, he replied, "The city has a new god now. Let it crown him." By 1419, Wenceslaus had all but vanished from political life. Rebellions simmered in the streets. Hussite factions organized militias, priests were attacked, monasteries torched. And in Prague, a revolution was brewing, not just against the church, but against the very throne that had abandoned them. A city once ruled by kings was now listening to war drums. That August, a message arrived at the hunting lodge. The radicals in Prague had stormed the town hall. 7 city officials were thrown from windows to their deaths. The defenestration of Prague. A spark had become a blaze, and when Wenceslaus received the news, something in him broke. The man who had once screamed at walls now fell into absolute stillness. Hours passed. No commands were given. No prayers were uttered. That night, he retired alone to his private chamber. By morning, he was dead. They found him curled on the floor, mouth open, hands clawed into the wood, eyes frozen wide, no signs of struggle, no wounds, just the final image of a king consumed by something no one could see, but Bohemia would see it soon. Because his death was not an ending, it was a door, and on the other side waited war. He died quietly, but what came after screamed. Wenceslaus's corpse was cold by dawn, but Bohemia had only just begun to burn. His death did not bring mourning, it brought motion. In the vacuum he left behind, the Hussites rose, not as mourners, but as soldiers. Jan Hus was their martyr, Wenceslaus, their symbol of everything that had failed. Crown, church, empire, they were all guilty. And so the kingdom his father built descended into a new religion of rage. Within months, Prague was in full rebellion. Nobles fled, bishops hid, cities fractured into war camps. It wasn't just a civil war. It was an unraveling of order itself. One side held crosses, the other torches. And in the chaos, both cried out for a justice they claimed had been denied too long. From the ashes of Wenceslaus's indecision rose the Hussite wars, bloody, unrelenting, apocalyptic. His body was buried without procession. No imperial banner draped his coffin. No choir sang. His crown was removed by shaking hands as if it might still curse the living. And in the years that followed, no statue was built, no prayers offered. His memory became a shadow, an embarrassment whispered about in the corridors of history. A king remembered not for his reign, but for his decay. Yet somehow his presence lingered, in the cities that burned, in the bloodied sermons. In the forests where armies marched under broken banners, he left no air of strength, no vision of peace, only a legacy of failure that festered in every rebellion that followed. They said he died of shock, others claimed poison. A few whispered it was divine justice, but the truth lay deeper, colder. Wenceslaus IV didn't die because of what he did. He died because of what he allowed and what he unleashed. He was the last breath before a scream. And the echo of that scream would haunt Bohemia for generations. He never lost his crown, he just rotted beneath it. Wenceslaus IV didn't fall by sword, nor by coup, nor by foreign hand. He decayed slowly, silently, until there was nothing left to rule but shadows and ruin. His legacy was not carved in triumph or conquest, but in silence, fear, and the madness he wore like a second crown. And when he died, alone, forgotten, curled on a wooden floor, it wasn't the end of a reign. It was the end of a mind. The kind of end no monument dares to honor. But he was not the only king swallowed by madness. If you thought Wenceslaus was unfit for the crown, wait until you meet Christian VII of Denmark, a royal whose wife ran to another man, whose doctor ruled in his place, and whose own son refused to call him father. And if you want to see madness turned violent, follow the story of Eric XIV of Sweden, who trusted no one, saw betrayal in every glance, and painted his palace floor with the blood of his own men. This is Tortures of the Crown. If dark royalty, lost minds, and the horrors that lurk behind thrones speak to you, subscribe and meet us in the next descent into history's most broken kings. We'll be waiting.